Hi everyone, I'm Bill Holcomb and welcome to this week's watercolor tutorial packed full of tips for painting landscapes. This subject of Ayers Rock was recommended by my son Ross, who has been to Ayers Rock. We are going to break this painting of Ayers Rock in Australia down into 5 sections, which will include the sky, the rock texture, the middle ground, the trees, and finally the wildflowers in the foreground. You can also download my free sketch in the description below, where you will also find a list of the materials used. So let's get started. I'm starting with a mop brush with some Winsor Yellow. Then I'll be going into some Alizarin Crimson, coming all the way down to the top of the rock. In terms of tips, tip number 1 for your sky, I would suggest for wet in wet skies, mix up your colours in advance. So you see I've got the Winsor Yellow, the Scarlet Lake, the Winsor Blue, and then a combination of the Winsor Blue with some Scarlet Lake added for darker clouds. So mix up your colours in advance. It's also worth keeping the tissue to hand to mop up any excess moisture, that fluids that can gather at the ends of the paper and in different sections, so that you avoid creep back, etc. So using that mop brush for those washes, still very wet, so wet in wet sky. Then we will be going into the Winsor Blue. See me just mopping those edges. So Winsor Blue, still with the mop brush. Starting at the top, and as you know, with all my paintings, we are on a board and it is at an angle, a slope of about 25 degrees. So there is a block, perhaps of wood or something like that, at the top of the board, so that the surface of the paper slopes down from top to bottom. That ensures that the pigment slowly creeps down the paper and avoids puddles forming, and the paint then going in various directions and causing creep back and all sorts of problems. So the slope of the board helps avoid those problems. Now, my continuing tips for the sky is for the dark cloud, which is that mixture of Winsor Blue and Alizarin Crimson, use a flat brush. A flat brush means that you will maintain much more control in your cloud formations. Pointed brush, you can get away with it, but it's much easier with a flat brush. And I will be wanting to leave the area of the foliage for the tree light, because I will be coming on to that later, of course, but I don't want a conflict of dark clouds in the area of the foliage, where I will be needing to paint some white underpainting. Light, I should say light underpainting, sorry. Such as the Winsor Yellow, which will be coming on later. So continue with the flat brush for the cloud, shaping them up as interestingly as possible. And here I've chosen on purpose to have the cloud formations straight as possible, rather than very busy and mixed, or various shapes, etc. Because I want the emphasis to be upon the principal subject, the Ayers Rock. So dry that off with a hairdryer, including mopping up the edges. Now for the rocks, my various tips here. First tip is do your underpainting. Think of the overall coloration of the rock, which is a reddish color here, and do an underpainting with that color. Scarlet Lake is what we're using here. but occasionally we may add some variation in coloration. We've got Scarlet Lake and we have Alizarin Crimson. So we've got an underpainting of a combination of Scarlet Lake and Alizarin Crimson. So now for the rock, a good tip is when you're painting rock surfaces, think of the shapes that are involved in the rock formation, and you're effectively using your paintbrush to draw those shapes in the rock. So they're not being painted willy-nilly all over the place. It doesn't matter. They do matter. Think of the direction in which you are painting. You are using your paintbrush as a drawing technique to emphasize the shape of the rocks and the different features in the rock. And importantly, of course, think of the direction of the sun. So on this occasion, we've got the sun shining from the left over to the right, and therefore we've got shadows in different parts of the rock on the right side. What you will be able to do is a combination of things to give structure to the rocks. With your smaller brushes, such as number 6 and even number 2, but number 6, you can use the side of the brush scraping technique to give texture to the rocks. And you can lift where you wet certain areas, a small amount of water, then use a tissue to lift to show light areas on the rock. For the middle ground, make the most of those light areas. Those light areas will push your eye up the painting from the foreground to the middle ground, and they will show a nice contrast between those light areas and our subject matter, the Ayers Rock. The small bushes and little trees in between will add contrast between those light areas, and they do exist anyway, but for our convenience they exist and we can make the most of them. So a nice contrast in that middle ground area with the light areas and the various bushes and small trees. You can use your smallest brush here if you need to, drop to a number 2. If you study photographs of this subject matter, you will find that this painting is realistic to the actual subject. We are, of course, painting an impressionistic view of the subject matter, but we're also adding as much realism as possible. So they are features that you will find when studying photographs. It's important that you do pay attention to the coloration of the foreground, and therefore you see that I have dropped in some of the reddish color in the foreground. We will be having various clumps of bushes and so forth from the wildflowers in the foreground, but as an underpainting we have got that reddish earth color, and that also ties us in to the distant rock. So that's dried off with your hairdryer, and then we do the main trunk of the trees and the various branches, and of course when we do those there are various gaps that are created, and they'll be left as much as possible for realism in relation to the structure of the tree and the foliage. Make those various branches and twigs and limbs and etc. as interesting as possible. They say in nature there are no straight lines, not exactly straight lines, but of course we can think of various exceptions. So that's a general rule. So when doing these aspects of the tree, do them as broken as possible, as interesting as possible, avoiding straight lines, strictly straight lines. So for the tree, we're going to use the side of the brush scraping technique. This is my next tip, doing trees. do use that technique as much as possible when doing trees. Start as usual with your light wash, our Winsor Yellow here. And at first I've been using the number 12 brush, which is fine because of the manner in which we're using the brush. Side of the brush scraping, going from the light washes to the darker washes, and purposefully leaving various gaps within the branches of the trees and so forth. Also demonstrating here using a tissue to wipe off any excess. If I have too much fluid, too much pigment on the brush, then I could lose control, especially too much fluid. On this particular tree, you will notice from photographs of it that it has little strands as part of its foliage, and I will be including some of those a little bit later, just enough of them here to tell the story. You can use your smallest brush here, something like your number 2, to achieve that. So just continuing with the shaping of the trees with those various strands that I mentioned before, and scraping on different dark areas within the foliage, mixing that up. Then we will add in the foreground a shadow from the tree, bearing in mind, as I said before, the light is coming from the left, so shadows on the right. Then once that's dried off, we're adding to the foreground grasses and bushes area, which will eventually contain the wildflowers as well. And always remember that it's very useful to have a small square of the paper to the side that you can test the mixtures of your paint, whether there's enough of the pigment or not enough, or whether you've got too much water, not enough water, etc. If you test it on a piece of paper first before committing to your particular painting. I do that even now, although I've been painting for 40 years in transparent watercolors and other media. I still have that paper to the side and test it occasionally. Then for smaller strands, darker strands, use your small brush like your number 2. And on the top of these, we will be painting the various wildflowers. Now, for the wildflowers, a tip I can give you here, in the foreground here, these wildflowers, use something like a basting brush. It's got nice strands and the bristles there, they're firm, and they are all separated. They will enable you to quickly achieve what you need. And use the tissue to wipe off any excess moisture and pigment. Some people suggest using a fan brush, which I have used occasionally, but I find that this basting brush approach is better for something like this. I hope you find those 5 areas of useful tips of benefit to future learning, and thank you for watching, and look forward to seeing you next time.